active yet, comrades. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. Hello, welcome. This is the video lecture on Chekhov, Stanislavski, and realistic acting. So, Ibsen's work, we've read Ibsen, we've read A Doll's House, helped to spark a new, more serious approach to theater. For most of the public at the time that A Doll's House came out, theater was popular entertainment. It was hard for people to think of theater as anything other than that. It was not art, it was entertainment. Ibsen and other of his contemporary writers were writing new kinds of plays that were made to make the audience think and question. They were writing what they considered to be art. It wasn't just pop culture entertainment. This kind of work of Ibsen, of Chekhov, and others didn't fit well within the commercial theater of its time, understandably. Theater at that time was dominated by melodramas, big musical extravaganzas. A play about a woman leaving her husband, where she walks out the door and doesn't come back, did not fit very well in that context. So other playwrights also were writing plays that challenged the status quo. So the new realistic and naturalistic theater, like what Ibsen was doing, was scandalous, and it was subject to censorship. So a new kind of theater organization developed. This was called the Free Theater Movement. Free is kind of a misnomer. It was free in the sense that it was free from censorship. You still paid to see it. So what it was, Free Theater was really a private subscription-based theater company, which was a new idea at the time. So you subscribed to the theater for a season, like you would, for any theater company now, rather than just purchased a ticket to one performance. So it was like joining a club. Since it was not open to the general public, only to its own members, it was not subject to state censorship, which was something that happened a lot, especially with Ibsen's work. It was very controversial, and other playwrights as well. So it began at the Théâtre Libre, which was founded by André Antoine in 1887 in Paris. This was Doll's House came out in 1879, so this is after A Doll's House we get this whole new theater movement. Antoine's Free Theater focused on naturalism and realism. They produced Ibsen's play Ghosts, Strindberg's play Miss Julie. Um, they lasted about 7 years. They did about 100 shows in that time. And the Théâtre Libre inspired other similar ventures in other cities, the Freibühne in Berlin, the Independent Theatre Society in London. So these theaters usually produced what were avant-garde plays, naturalism and symbolism and realism, for a small and sort of select audience. The Moscow Art Theater, which is where we're going with this, was really a free theater. It was part of this worldwide movement. It was a subscription theater that was devoted to naturalism and realism. So Anton Chekhov, author of The Seagull, and the Moscow Art Theater, and the play The Seagull are important because this is where modern realistic acting developed. And the success of the Moscow Art Theater's production of Chekhov's play The Seagull saved the theater at a time when it was about to go bankrupt. So what Chekhov's plays, coupled with actor and director Konstantin Stanislavski's new acting technique, together they created an entirely new realistic style of acting, which could be taught to and reproduced by others. And this is still with us. Chekhov's plays proved to be the perfect vehicle for Stanislavski's ideas about acting, and we're still doing it. So, a little bit about Anton Chekhov. He was born in 1860, died in 1904. He was born in a small town called Taganrog. He was one of 6 kids. His grandfather had been a serf. His grandfather had been a slave, which is what serfdom is. His father was a merchant, and his father was kind of a dirtbag, really. He was sort of just the sleazy businessman who kind of exploited his own kids in a way. His father went bankrupt when Anton was about high school age. At that time, the family moved to Moscow. Chekhov stayed behind in Taganrog and finished high school there and then went to medical school in St. Petersburg. And to support his family, Chekhov wrote, he was a writer, so while he was in medical school, he was also writing. He was very popular. He wrote vaudeville sketches, short stories for magazines were kind of a new thing. Publishing, printing on that scale was a new thing, and there was quite a market for it. So Chekhov was very successful in that way. And in Russian culture, it was common for writers to write all different forms, not just to be a playwright, but to write short stories, to write novels, to write, you know, uh, newspaper stories, to be journalists. So Chekhov really did it all, but he specialized he was sort of seen as a humorist. He was quite funny. By the time that he finished medical school, he already had a literary career. So talk about someone who can do it all. And then after medical school, he worked as a medical doctor and he continued to write. He really seems to have enjoyed it. His first play was called Ivanov. Another famous short play early on is called The Bear, The Marriage Proposal, The Wood Demon, which later gets revised. And these are more comedic pieces. And like The Bear and The Marriage Proposal, we still perform translations of those. The other interesting thing is most of Chekhov's plays have a character in them who is a medical doctor. Um, and often this character is sort of the charming, handsome man. Like other women are in love with him. He's often, this medical doctor character in his plays is often one of the more compelling characters. And uh, Chekhov's picture is up here. He was a pretty handsome guy. He was sort of like Russia's most eligible literary bachelors for a lot of his life. In 1896, he writes The Seagull, and it gets produced by a provincial theater company, and it is such a disaster. It goes so horribly. The actors don't know how to act this piece. It's a disaster. Chekhov quits the theater. He gives up writing for the stage. However, Stanislavski discovered the script and persuaded Chekhov to let his new theater company do it. So in 1896, or I'm sorry, 1899, Moscow Art Theater produces Chekhov's play The Seagull. Stanislavski looks at it and says, I think I know how to act this. And it's amazing. It gets Chekhov back in the theater. So finally, there's a theater company that can act the kind of stuff he wants to write. So Chekhov starts to write for the Moscow Art Theater. And along the way, he meets the woman in the picture up there, Olga Nipper. She's one of the leading actresses of of the Moscow Art Theater. So they fall in love. They marry. Um, Let me see. He marries her in 1901. Olga played all the lead roles that Chekhov wrote. So he was writing for his wife. Arkadina in the original production of The Seagull, she took on that role. The play already exists. And then he wrote his later plays with her in mind. Masha in The Three Sisters was written for her. Elena in Uncle Vanya. Ranevskaya in Cherry Orchard. So the great Chekhov roles were written for his wife. He contracted tuberculosis, the same thing that Torvald has, when he was 23, and it forced him to leave Moscow and move to the town of Yalta, which is in a warm part of Russia. It's on the seaside. And he lived most of his life there. He died when he was 44, so he didn't live to be very old. His final play, he was really in poor health when the Cherry Orchard was in rehearsal. So Chekhov is really known for four plays, but they're really complex, deep, interesting plays, especially for actors. I had said earlier there's really no such thing. We have realism, naturalism, expressionism in the theater. There's really no such thing in theater as impressionism, like there is in visual art. But if there were, Chekhov would be it. He creates these really subtle um, characters, and it's all about the internal life of his characters, that these sort of impressions of things build up one upon the other. So not a lot happens. There's not a lot of action really in Chekhov's plays, but there's quite a journey. So they're really interesting in that way. So a few things to know. I had mentioned serfs, right? No, that's a smurf. There's serfs. Russia had a system of slavery that dated back to the medieval system of serfdom. Serfs were peasants who belonged to the land, so to speak. They were owned by the owner of the land that they worked. And serfdom, it was slavery, but it was not racially based. It was a class system. So if you were born a serf, you would die a serf. There was no such thing as class mobility under this system. Now, serfdom was abolished at about the time slavery was abolished in the US in the 1860s. So that occurred, serfdom had been abolished about 35 years before the action of, of Chekhov's plays. Although it had been abolished, in real life, although serfdom had been abolished, the lives of the peasants didn't change very much. Most of them continued to work on the estates, which were like American plantations. They continued to work the land for wages. And in Chekhov's plays, sometimes the older servant characters, which are usually small characters in the play, will express a desire to return to the old way, which is slavery. They felt like things were a little better under the slavery system. So, with serfdom having been abolished, a middle class starts to develop in Russia. And often the middle class in Russia were the children of former serfs who became merchants or were better educated and became doctors. And that is Chekhov's story. His grandfather had been a serf, his father was a merchant and not a very good one, and then he became a doctor. We see this sort of generational rising. So there was this small class of doctors, teachers, other professionals in Russia, um, which Chekhov belonged to, but it was a very small class. Russian society was this elite, upper, noble class, a huge underclass of peasants, and this very small middle class of people like Chekhov, writers, teachers, doctors, etc. The other thing to keep in mind with reading Chekhov especially is he is great because of the subtext, which is the meaning beneath the lines. Human beings rarely ever say what they really mean, and this is what Chekhov captures as a writer. It's often difficult to get that when you're reading the play, though. It's much easier to convey it in performance. So as you read, think about what the characters are saying and think about their possible motives for what they are saying. Often the characters are hiding more than they are revealing in their words. So a lot of the play, a lot of what's really going on with the characters isn't even said. It's unstated. It's unrequited love, unfulfilled desires, unexpressed whatever, which makes it a great acting challenge and a lot of fun to watch because it's very much what people act like in real life. But it can be a little difficult to read sometimes when you're trying to figure out what's actually going on here. So another thing, and something that can make reading Chekhov, seem kind of difficult, are the way Russian names work. Okay, so here's how they work. So if we take Chekhov himself and his sister as an example. Okay, so we have Chekhov's name was Anton Pavlovich Chekhov, and his sister was Maria Pavlovna Chekhova. Everyone in Russia has a first name, Anton, a middle name or a patronym, Pavlovich, and a last name, Chekhov. Everybody gets their father's first name for a middle name. That's your patronym. So Anton and Maria's father's name was Pavel. For men, the patronym ends in ICH, son of. So Anton Pavlovich is Anton, son of Pavel. Female patronyms end in ovna, daughter of. Maria Pavlovna is daughter of Pavel. Everybody gets their last name from their father, and men have no suffix on their name, so it's just Chekhov. Women have an A at the end. So Maria Pavlova, see, it's hard. Maria Pavlovna Chekhova and Anton Pavlovich Chekhov are brother and sister, even though to us their last name seems a little different. The other thing that's hard is everybody has a million nicknames, and they tend to refer to one another by multiple names. So Maria might be Masha, Mashenka, Mashka, whatever. So just keep that in mind. That's how Russian names work, and it is weird. It's a cultural thing. But there you go. So theater is, like I say, always a product of the society that creates it. With A Doll's House, I talked about the origins of modernity at the end of the 19th century. That was the shifts in thought, the advancements in technology, the political shifts that helped to bring about the sort of modern mindset that we live in now. Chekhov was also a product of his time and place. His plays really capture turn-of-the-century Russian society, but they also speak to us today because his characters seem so human. He's also important because of his connections to Stanislavski and the Moscow Art Theater, which is where method acting, realistic acting begins. This bit is about how modernity impacted Russia and how this plays out in Chekhov's plays. Realistic plays existed before realistic acting. Ibsen's plays were out there before there was a realistic way to act them, and it's really through Chekhov's work that we get that. So Chekhov is writing about a country that is struggling to modernize. Now, Russia had eliminated serfdom or slavery in 1861, about the same time that the US did. But he's writing 30 years later. Russia still had a hereditary monarchy. And Chekhov himself was from the small middle class that I had talked about. So most of Russian society consisted of peasants, former serfs and their descendants, and a gentry, this upper class, and there was very little in between them. So this is an overview of the political world that created Chekhov and informed his plays. And it's also the story of Russian czars and a revolution. So first we have Alexander II. He was alive from 1855 to 1881. He was known as Alexander the Liberator. He is the one who freed the serfs. He was a very forward-thinking monarch. He really brought Russia into the 19th century. Russia is a big country, has a lot of resources, but it's, always been sort of backwards. So Alexander II reformed the judicial system, promoted local self-government, which is a huge thing, just having a local town council. And this comes out in some of Chekhov's plays where they talk about the town council, and it seems like, we think, so what? But this was a huge innovation in Russia, to have some say in your own governance. He promoted universities, planned railroads, emancipated the serfs. He annexed Poland. That was not good with the Poles. But he was a, good, just, forward-thinking monarch. And then he was assassinated by socialist revolutionaries in 1881. Which brings us to Alexander the Third. He was the son of Alexander the Second, and he was everything his father was not. He was backwards, he was conservative, he was very reactionary. He undid almost everything his father had done. His motto was Russian orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The Russian Orthodox Church was the official religion. Autocracy, we still believe in the monarchy, and Russian national identity. He started persecuting the Jews, which actually drove immigration to the US, especially, Jews from Eastern Europe. But not a popular guy. He was followed by his son, Nicholas II, known as Nicholas the Bloody, or, in hindsight, the last Tsar. Um, his coronation got off to a bad start when, as part of the celebration, there was a crowd stampede and several people were killed. He got Russia into a war with Japan and lost, which Russia is this huge country. Japan is very small, was pretty weak at the time, and they spanked Russia. So this did not, make him any more popular. He led Russia into World War I, in which 3.3 million Russians died. There was a 1905 revolution. He continued the anti-Jewish pogroms. This was the, persecution of the Jews. He was eventually forced to abdicate the throne in 1917, and he was executed the next year, along with the Russian royal family. And if you're a Disney fan, this is where the Anastasia story comes in. She was supposedly the long-lost daughter of the family that survived the execution. That may or may not be a true story. Anyway, but he is the last Tsar. And he is followed by glorious Soviet era of Russian history. 1917, a revolution broke out. Russia was briefly a democratic state, but it was dominated by the Communist Party, and it becomes the Soviet Union in 1922. So the US and Russia were allies in World War II, but after the war, Russia and the US became rival world powers, and then we get into the era of the Cold War. This is after World War II, so this is quite a bit later. But during that time, there was very little travel or cultural exchange between Russia and the West, Western Europe, the US, from the end of World War II to about 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so you're probably wondering, why do I care about any of this? Well, like I said, theater is a product of its time. We're formed by the times in which we live. And the thing is, Chekhov, as well as Stanislavski and his partner in the Moscow Art Theater, Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko, that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, so we tend to refer to them as Stan and Dan. Anyway, they were all born under the reign of Alexander II, the progressive, liberalizing monarch, the one who is going to lead Russia to join the rest of the world, you know, reform everything. They were born under his reign, and their youth was under him. Their formative years, from their, teens into their 30s and 40s, were spent under Alexander III, this period of reactionary backsliding. We're going to turn back the clock. Um, that's where they spent most of their young adulthood. And then the Moscow Art Theater is formed, opens under the reign of Nicholas II. So things sort of started to move forward with Nicholas. Things were liberal at Nicholas II. Things were liberalizing a bit. But all three men had been born in this sort of period of hope in Russia. And as young men in their in their young adulthood, watched it all kind of go to crap, right? Everything was turning back. And this is reflected in Chekhov's plays. You see this sort of um, ruined idealist. And it's sort of like if you think of, I've compared it to like the baby boomers, people who were raised in the Kennedy era when, the country was great and things were moving forward, it was very progressive. And then you think, the 70s and afterwards, they kind of became, embittered idealists. So Chekhov's plays are the work of a disappointed idealist. He's writing about a world that is crumbling around him, a society that's falling apart, and in some cases, deservedly so. The old order is falling apart, falling away. There seems to be something coming. They don't know what. And maybe it's a good thing, and maybe it's not a good thing. In hindsight, what was coming was the revolution, and for the class depicted in Chekhov's plays, it wasn't such a good thing. But there is that sense of something on the horizon. So realistic writing for the stage was already occurring in Russia when they founded the Moscow Art Theater. Russian writers were already writing realistic plays. The theater was performed according to 18th century conventions. In the 1880s and 1890, a German theater company that specialized in doing stage realism, which meant realistic sets and costumes, not so much realistic acting, toured Russia, and it sparked a lot of interest in realism in Russia. So the Russians had realistic plays to do, but they didn't quite have a way to play it. So Stanislavski, he came from a wealthy family. His father was a factory owner, his grandmother had been an actress, but his family asked him to change his last name before he went on the stage because being an actor was just a shameful thing to do. But he was a professional actor. He saw this German group, was fascinated by the stage realism, but troubled by the declamatory acting. So in 1888, he founds his own theater company, and it was noted for producing Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, great Russian writers. Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko, he was a playwright and director of a drama school. So in 1898, Danchenko invites Stanislavski to help him form a new theater, the Moscow Art Theater. So they met at 2 in the afternoon for lunch and stayed at a restaurant and stayed until 8 a.m. the next day. This is like the epic organizational meeting, and I'm sure the waiters were just thrilled. But the way it came down is Danchenko was responsible for the literary and administrative end of the new company. Stanislavski was an actor and a director, and they were really influenced by the free theater movement. Stanislavski evolved a new method of acting for realistic drama at the Moscow Art Theater, and it was really a system to train people to do this kind of acting by method instead of just by accident or trial and error, which is kind of how they had been doing it. This was acting that replicated real life. So the Moscow Art Theater focused on research, attention to detail, and long rehearsal periods. They would do 3 to 5 new plays a year, but they also kept old plays in a repertory. Chekhov's work remains in the repertory. The Moscow Art Theater survived the Russian Revolution and the Soviet era. So why does this matter? Well, remember how I said when the first production of The Seagull bombed so badly that Chekhov gave up writing for the stage. He was so humiliated. He gave it up. He was writing plays that were not actable in his day and age. They hadn't invented a way to play these yet. So Stanislavski recognized that, and so Chekhov's work gave Stanislavski and the Moscow Art Theater a, the kind of plays that they wanted to do, that apply, the place to apply this new acting technique. The other thing is the Seagull saved the Moscow Art Theater. The Moscow Art Theater was on the skids financially at the time that they did that play. So it was a huge hit for the Moscow Art Theater. So much so that the poster I showed early in this slideshow of the original program, it has this sort of abstract design of a seagull. That was the original program for the show at the Moscow Art Theater. The seagull has become the symbol or the logo for the Moscow Art Theater. So Chekhov's play The Seagull saved the Moscow Art Theater. It gave Stanislavski a place to apply method acting. So all of these things kind of work together. It's a really important moment in modern theater. And after the success of The Seagull, Chekhov continued to write for the Moscow Art Theater. His last three plays were all written expressly for Moscow Art Theater. And for Chekhov, he met the love of his life there, Olga Nipper. So it all works together. It's a great story, I think. Stanislavski codified his acting technique. He trained other people in how to do it, and it spread. And today, method acting, Stanislavski's realistic acting, is the dominant mode. It's hard for us to imagine anything else. So there you have it. So just a quick breakdown of the play itself. The play takes place on an estate, a summer residence on a lake. It is the 1890s for most of the play. The final act happens 2 years later. And the characters in the play, we have Arkadina, a successful stage actress, a woman somewhere in her 40s. She's a little hazy about how old she actually is. Her son is Treplev. He's in Konstantin Treplev. He's in his early 20s, and he wants to be a playwright or a writer. And then there is Soren, Arkadina's older brother. He's a man in his early 60s. So that's one family unit. Then we have Nina, the daughter. She's the daughter of a neighboring family. She's 18. She's beautiful. She wants to be an actress. And Treplev or Konstantin is in love with her. Another family that's present in the play is Shamraev. He is a retired military man, and his job is to manage this estate for Soren and Arkadina. His wife is Polina, his wife, and his daughter is Masha, a young woman in her 20s. She's in love with Treplev. Okay, Treplev's in love with Nina. All right, so then we get over to the other side here. We have Trigorin. He's a successful writer. He is Arkadina's lover, her boyfriend, right? He's also in his 40s. There is the doctor character, Dr. Dorn. He's a man in his 50s. And then Medvedenko, who is a local school teacher. He's in his later 20s. Trigorin is Arkadina's partner, but Nina is in love with him. So we have a big old love triangle going on here. And there's some other love affairs going on in the play too. So socially, politically, the world that Chekhov is portraying in his plays, it's very different than the one we live in. But what's true is he really creates these fully realized characters. There are no villains in his plays. The characters might do something horrible one minute and then turn around and be absolutely wonderful the next. They're like real human beings. So that's really interesting to read and play. This is something Chekhov said. It is necessary that on stage everything should be as complex and as simple as in life. People are having dinner, and while they are having it, their future happiness may be decided, or their lives may about to be shattered. The final thing to remember is Chekhov called The Seagull a comedy in 4 acts. So just chew on that as you read it, because you might read it and think, boy, there's not much funny here. But he really viewed his characters as flawed human beings, and he found great humor in that, although it's not the kind of humor you actually laugh at. I don't know. So anyway, I hope you enjoy reading the play, and I will see you next week. Thanks.